This is the Internet Skeptic's Guide to Global Warming. We're going to take a hard look at all the evidence supporting the claims that man is causing global warming, and once we do that, we're going to let you decide. The presentation that you're viewing today can be downloaded at www.theinternetskeptic.com. Go to the PowerPoint page and you can download this presentation. Each one of the pages has a link to the original source, so any claim that will be made, you can simply download the presentation, click on the image or the link, and it'll take you to the supporting documentation. This is global warming as defined by the Union of Concerned Scientists. Greenhouse gases build up in our atmosphere, trapping the sun's light, and it acts as an insulating layer around the Earth, causing warming of the Earth. These are two charts that come from John Hart, University of Berkeley, showing the increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide on the left, and on the right you can see the world energy consumption. Clearly, the relationship trying to be demonstrated here is that as man has burned fossil fuels, atmospheric carbon dioxide has increased. This is another look at atmospheric CO2, and as you can see, today is essentially 330 parts per million, which is 25% higher than at any time before in the history on that chart. 2100, the atmospheric CO2 will have more than doubled, as predicted by global warming science. Well, we saw what they predict for CO2, 25% higher than any time before in history. Here is what is called the hockey stick chart, or the temperature chart for the last 1,000 years. Viewing this chart, you can see temperatures were essentially flat for the vast majority of the last 1,000 years, but recently has spiked upwards, causing the temperatures to reach a record high, at least as far as the last 1,000 years, as claimed by global warming scientists. There are some headlines that I got off of MSNBC, and as you can see, the first half of 2006, the warmest on record in the U.S., as claimed by these scientists. The claim obviously is man has increased atmospheric CO2, and as a result has resulted in record temperatures globally. Another claim that we'll be taking a look at is whether or not there's a global warming consensus. Here's the headlines from the Washington Post: undeniable global warming. Essentially, the drumbeat has been there's a global warming consensus. Nobody disagrees with it. The few skeptics are essentially wrong. But we're going to take a look at the data and take a skeptical look, and we're going to let you decide whether or not the skeptics are right or not. Okay, what are the facts as far as global warming science goes? The facts are, as they see it, is CO2 is a global warming gas. Man produces CO2. CO2 causes global warming. Man has essentially tipped the balance by putting an unnatural amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, so man-made or anthropogenic CO2 is the main cause of global warming. That is the theory that we're going to be addressing. We're going to take a look at the data and see whether or not the data supports that conclusion. Before we go any further, I want to take a look back. Just within the last 30 years, the climate scientists have been off by a full 180 degrees. When I was growing up, back in the 70s, they were telling us there was a coming ice age. Global warming wasn't even on the map. The article on the left in this graphic is Remember Global Cooling? It's a recent article in Newsweek going back and reviewing what they had said back in 1975. The 1975 article is to the right in this graphic, and it was titled The Cooling World. So once again, just within the last 30 years, the climate scientists have been off 100 degrees. So right off the bat, that should give you pause as far as their credibility. Other claims that were made back in the 70s was the population bomb. We were supposed to have overcrowded the earth by this time. There was also in the 70s, Jimmy Carter somberly told the nation that we could use up all the proven reserves of oil in the entire world by the end of the next decade. As we know, what happened, however, was we didn't end up with a shortage of oil. We actually ended up with a glut of oil in the 80s and 90s, and just recently energy prices have started to go higher. So once again, their predictability is very suspect. Today, climate scientists are telling us that we have to fear the melting of the polar ice caps. Well, ironically, back in the 70s, in that article, The Cooling World, they literally proposed melting the Arctic ice cap by covering it with black soot. This is an article from the same year that came from National Geographic. Highlighted a few of the quotes. The first being, experts agree they cannot yet predict climate change with any assurance. Global warming was downplayed and actually beneficial, stating that it would increase arable land. And ironically, back then when global cooling was the fear, they claimed that cooler climates would be less stable, one marked by storms, floods, and freezes. You can remove the freezes, and every claim that they made back then that was being caused by global cooling is exactly what they're claiming global warming is causing today. You'll hear all the hype about global warming causing the hurricanes. Well, back then they were claiming global cooling was causing all the hurricanes. Essentially, they just take the whatever weather condition is going on and they blame it on whatever weather condition they say is going on, either cooling or warming. Here's another claim that turned out to be essentially bogus. Once again, many of you will remember the ozone hole. Well, you didn't hear a lot. You haven't heard a lot about the ozone hole recently, and the reason why is because the Arctic ozone hole is hitting the biggest on record. This is just a recent report. Why is that significant? Well, that's significant because concentrations of ozone-depleting chemicals in the lower atmosphere have been declining since 1995. So how can a declining concentration cause a record high in the ozone hole if, in fact, the CFCs were causing the ozone hole? More importantly, as you can see, you can't quite read the article at the very bottom there. You can if you download the presentation, but it talks about 35,000 people dying from heat stroke over in Europe. I would argue that because we banned CFCs, we made refrigerants much more expensive. Many of those people over in Europe didn't have air conditioning because they couldn't afford it, because refrigerants are much more expensive. So as you can see, there is a true human cost involved when we chase our tails following these unsubstantiated claims about all the harm that we're doing to the environment. The ozone hole being a great example. CFCs have been decreasing, and yet it's hitting record highs. If anything, it looks like maybe the CFCs were preventing the ozone hole from getting bigger, and we actually need them. If if you want a relationship, we decrease the concentration, the hole got bigger, cause and effect. That's maybe we should take a look at. And once again, the environmentalists and the climate scientists would have been 180 degrees off from reality. Bottom line is their claim that if we ban CFCs would solve the ozone hole certainly hasn't held water. Here's another claim where the environmentalists have been 100% off or 180 degrees off. DDT. Recently, the WHO, the World Health Organization, is actually recommending the use of malaria indoors. Unfortunately, the cost up until getting to this point has been almost 1 million lives a year lost to malaria that could have easily been prevented had we not banned DDT. More importantly, much of the research that was used to ban DDT was either misinterpreted or erroneously presented. For instance, pheasant eggs. The big claim was that it made the eggs thinner. Well, actually, what happened when they did tests, they found out that pheasants that were given large doses of DDT over a year, while their eggs may have thinned a little bit, and that is questionable, the fact are that those eggs had a higher survival rate than the controls group. So once again, the environmentalists had a rush to judgment. We banned DDT. It ended up costing many lives, and just today we're getting to the point where we're beginning to reverse the harm that was done by the banning of DDT. Here's just another one of these mass hysteria examples that is back in the news again today. Silicone breast implants. We were scared to death about the hazards and the harms and the dangers of these silicone breast implants. Well, just this week, FDA says yes to silicone breast implants. Essentially found out that any relationship between silicone and diseases, connective tissue diseases, or whatever the claims were purely coincidence and not there was not a correlation. There was not a cause and effect relationship there. However, to get to this point, we bankrupted Dow Corning. We destroyed many lives, destroyed many jobs, destroyed a company, and many people's retirements, and also many women. I mean, just look at the woman to the left here. She's scared to death. We scared a lot of women unnecessarily, and many of them went and had additional surgeries unnecessarily. So once again, we have to be careful when we start making these claims, because we do, in fact, impact many people's lives. Here is just another example of a lot of hype has occurred to frighten us of basically a non-existent threat, irradiated foods. If you think about it, that's what a microwave does. I mean, do you honestly think using a microwave on your food is harmful? Looking at many of these changes, like the population bomb, the DDT, the silicone, the irradiated foods, the acid rain, the ozone hole, one thing after another, there almost seems to be this Luddite type of a characteristic, or a rage against the machine. The environmentalists seem to do anything, grasp at any kind of straw they can in order to slow down the progress of man, slow down growth, slow down man using natural resources, and slow the population growth of man. Before we go any further, I want to review data do's and don'ts, and I want you to think in terms of, if a drug company did this or followed this kind of a practice, would you trust that drug company? Would that drug get approved? So I want to review, how do you treat data? The first thing I want you to think of when we review the upcoming data is, if you have a way to measure something, do you want to measure it directly or with a proxy? An example would be, if you have a birth certificate, you can measure someone's age, or you could estimate their age by looking at their teeth. Clearly, given the two, you would want to go with a direct measurement over a proxy. You'd want to use a birth certificate, not someone's teeth, to estimate their age. You'd also want to use, if you're doing a study, you might want to, and you find a finding, you might want to check confirming methodologies. If you're measuring temperature, for instance, you might want to use a mercury thermometer, then you might want to use an electronic thermometer, then you might want to use an alcohol thermometer. But you want to be able to confirm your findings with other methodology, if possible. You also want to take multiple measurements. You don't want to just take one and leave it at that. For instance, if you are being diagnosed for blood pressure, you would check blood pressure many times before you reach the conclusion that you have blood pressure. Multiple time periods, you want to take the measurements throughout the day, throughout the year, and at various intervals. Also, if you're going to be measuring something like global warming, you'd want to take measurements at multiple locations. If you're going to take the average of the cities in the United States, you wouldn't just take an average of one city's population. You'd take an average of all the cities you could find in the United States. Okay, well, let's go back to the future and let's take a look at this data. I am showing you here the two charts that we're going to be addressing, because I believe that these are the cornerstones of global warming theory. The chart on the left is carbon dioxide. The chart on the right is temperature. As you can see on the left, as CO2, atmospheric CO2 increased, it caused, as far as the theory goes, it caused temperature to increase. So the theory that we're going to be reviewing, and with the data that we're going to be reviewing, is the data pertaining to atmospheric CO2 and their temperatures. The theory is CO2 increases causes temperature to increase. Okay, first we're going to take a look at the greenhouse gas CO2. While it's hard to see, this is a chart coming directly from the IPCC, the International Panel of Climate Change report. In this report, and I have arrows there that are highlighting the data that I'm referring to. You can't see it on this presentation, but you can, once again, download the presentation to see it. The important thing is that in this chart, in the IPCC report, they clearly identify water vapor as a global warming gas. Also, they refer to CO2 as a trace gas. This chart, once again, is a little difficult to read, but the take-home message when you look at this is that the IPCC reviews all the data they've got for global warming. In this chart, it reviews the global warming gases. When you look at this chart very closely, what you will find is that they totally ignore water vapor. While they identify water vapor as a global warming gas, in the discussion, they totally ignore it and act it as if it doesn't even exist. This page tries to address what the IPCC did not address, and that being the impact or the global warming potential of water vapor. working backwards from the data that is provided, the researcher who produced this report determines that water vapor has a global warming potential 270 times that of carbon dioxide. More importantly, they also point out, and I have the second part there just to highlight how they address the fact that water vapor was not addressed in the IPCC report. It says clearly, weighted estimates for water vapor are not presented because the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has not established a definitive global warming potential factor for water vapor. Now I ask you, and this is once again a simple scientific question, how could you reach a scientific consensus that man-made CO2 is causing global warming if in fact you don't even have a global warming potential calculation for water vapor in your report? Does that make any sense at all? Because as we'll see later on, water vapor is believed to be the most significant greenhouse gas. So how you can reach the conclusion that man-made CO2 is the culprit without understanding water vapor is beyond me. This is just a report that comes from the EPA, and what I have highlighted there is that they have the global warming potential and contribution of various greenhouse gases, but when it comes to water vapor, as you can see there, it is NA. They just simply produce a report that says we don't know what contribution water vapor is making. The reason I have Richard Nixon there is that this looks to me like a clear cover-up, because every scientist would know that if you're going to reach a conclusion, you better understand all variables, and you have to understand all their interaction. You don't just simply reach a conclusion stating the fact that you don't know some of the data about some of the most significant variables. Okay, this comes from the website called Real Climate, and it is a website maintained by some of the preeminent global warming scientists out there. If you read this article, which is too small to read right here, you'll see that even they admit that water vapor is by far the most significant greenhouse gas out there. Also, and I throw this out for you to do your own research, if in fact carbon dioxide was causing global warming, you would find reports all over the place about scientists who simply took an aquarium, sealed it off, altered the CO2 concentration under equal lighting from a light source, and measured the temperature change. If in fact a small change of CO2 from 270 to 330 parts per million would cause global warming, you'd just simply have a terrarium, increase the CO2, shine the same amount of light on it, and you would register a temperature increase. I have yet to see any of those reports done, and yet that is the first thing I would have expected to come out of the global warming scientists if in fact they did this and their conclusions supported their claims. Here is a chart that shows the relative contributions of global warming gases. As you can see, water vapor constitutes Earth's most significant greenhouse gas, accounting for about 95% of the Earth's greenhouse effect. That means there's only 5% left to divide between CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, and other miscellaneous gases. Clearly, there's just not enough importance assigned to CO2 and global warming that less than 5% of global warming is due to CO2, and yet you keep hearing this drumbeat that CO2 is the most significant greenhouse gas. The question you should be asking right now is, how, if water vapor is the most significant greenhouse gas, do they make carbon dioxide sound like it's so significant? Well, it's very easy. Every chart that you'll see having to do with greenhouse gases, including the IPCC and that EPA report that I just showed you, simply removes water vapor from the mixture. And so what you do is you get charts that only focus on the remaining greenhouse gases, and out of the remaining greenhouse gases, CO2 is the most significant. However, in the grand scheme of things, it is highly insignificant as far as a global warming gas. Okay, so if water vapor is the most significant greenhouse gas, and man, remember, only produces 5% of all atmospheric CO2, when we put all these numbers together, man produces 0.28% of all global warming greenhouse gases. 0.28. If you look at that pie chart, you can barely even see the blue wedge next to the green. And so that's the problem the global warming theory has to deal with. It somehow has to make it sound like a 0.28% can cause catastrophic effects. In my opinion, the numbers just simply aren't there. Man does not produce enough to really have an impact on the globe. This is simply a graphic I got off of Google Images that addresses this issue. It claims that water vapor is up to 40,000 parts per million, plus or minus 10,000 of air volume. Carbon dioxide has a concentration of 270 parts per million, and it is a much weaker greenhouse gas. So you can see that this is a well-known fact. It's just not advertised by Al Gore and other global warming scientists. Let's take a look at the data, and I'm going to let you decide what you think about this. This is the actual CO2 chart provided by John Hart and used by Al Gore and very many global warming scientists. It shows the increasing concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. However, look very closely. If you notice, prior to 1950, it's ice core data. After 1950, it's Mauna Loa, air samples taken from a volcano in Hawaii. They don't highlight that in the movie, but I don't think most people understood that when they showed a CO2 graph, it is a very dissimilar graph of CO2 combining two sample sites that are totally dissimilar. The first being Arctic core data going back in time, and Mauna Loa going from 1950 forward. Well, remember when I covered the data do's and don'ts? Well, here is definitely a data don't. It makes no sense to combine so totally dissimilar data sources into one continuous chart. First of all, you have Arctic ice core, which is at sea level, surrounded by no biomass, okay, freezing, and once again, it's a core sample. Mauna Loa is a CO2 spewing volcano. It is 13,700 feet, surrounded by biomass, surrounded by a CO2 breathing ocean, and it's a flask data or an air grab sample or a direct measurement of CO2. So in order to create that chart, they use a proxy, being an ice core sample, and a direct measurement. Clearly the direct measurements are more reliable. Also, the very dissimilar sites make no sense why you would combine them. The other question you would simply ask is, why would they be taking ice core samples from the Arctic? Why wouldn't they simply use air grab samples from the Arctic instead of going down to Mauna Loa? At least that way they can say that the CO2 concentration was from the same area and it's a continuous chart. It doesn't make any sense to go, take core samples from the Arctic and then not take flask samples, but instead go down to Mauna Loa and take flask samples there from a totally dissimilar area. This is just a graphic to highlight that issue. Why wouldn't you simply take ice core samples for a certain set of time period, and then if you needed to take flask samples, why wouldn't they have just continued to take them from the Arctic? That way you can say that at least the data source or the data location for atmospheric CO2 would be consistent. But instead they decided to fly all the way down to Mauna Loa, go up 13,700 feet, and do an air grab sample. So there's the first flaw that is really evident as far as this data collection and data maintenance. The combining of two dissimilar data sets, and the fact that they had a way to have a direct measurement of atmospheric CO2 in the Arctic, and they chose not to do that. They took the direct measurement from Mauna Loa. Because these two data sets, and just to give you an example on why this is important, are so dissimilar, this would be like doing a long-term weight study. And for the first half of the century, up to 1950, you went out and you measured the weights of sumo wrestlers. Then, For the second half of your study, you decided to measure the weights after 1950. You only measured the weights of only top models. Doing that and then combining those two data sources, what you would see is that the average weight severely drops off in the second half of the century. Using the global warming logic, what you would then conclude is that the average weight of people has dramatically decreased in the second half of the century. Clearly that isn't what has happened. Actually, probably the opposite has happened. But by manipulating the data the way that they have done it, you can essentially prove that pigs can fly by doing that kind of data manipulation. The question you should be asking yourself right now is, why are they using a proxy for atmospheric CO2, meaning a core sample? Were there flash samples or air grab samples available that they could have used? Because once again, air grab samples are direct measurements of atmospheric CO2. Core samples are proxies. Well, sure enough, they exist. There's a set of data out there that has air grab samples going back to the early 1800s. And not only are the air grab samples going back to the 1800s, they're from around the world, Peru, North America, and Europe. So you get a better feel for what the true global atmospheric CO2 is. Now you're asking yourself, why didn't they use that? Well, once again, if they were to use that, one, the chart would go all the way back to 1800 instead of just 1950, which is what they're doing with Mauna Loa. And when you look at the chart, the big problem is back in the early 1800s, atmospheric CO2 was all the way up to 550. The current level is 370. So the flask data, the direct measurement, shows atmospheric CO2 actually falling. If you take a look at the average of all that data, the average of all that data is 335. The current level is 370. So we're barely above the average, and we're way below the maximum that has occurred in since the 1800s, and that's 550. So when Al Gore says we're at record levels CO2, that is not a true statement if you're going to use direct measurements, which are more accurate for atmospheric CO2. Only when you combine core samples, which are proxies, with direct measurements from Mauna Loa, can you make the claim that that chart, that combination of dissimilar data sets is reaching an all-time high. However, once again, I wouldn't put a lot of faith in any kind of a chart that's made from two totally dissimilar spots like that, one at sea level, one at 13,000 feet, one being a direct measurement, one being a proxy. It's just not good data. The difference of location and proxy versus direct measurement isn't the only problem you have with that CO2 chart. If you noticed in the one graphic, you'll see the gentleman taking the ice core sample. When he does that, he has to dig down through feet of snow before he even gets to the ice. When he gets down to the ice, that ice is essentially 100 or so years old. So when you look at the actual raw data used to construct that CO2 chart, what you see is that the ice core data actually stops about 100 years ago. Then it picks up from Mauna Loa in 1950. So there's a gap in the data. More importantly, if you look at the last set of data for ice core, which is in about 1891, it is above the level of Mauna Loa in 1950. This graphic highlights that issue. As you can see, the 1891 level of core sample CO2 is above the 1950 of Mauna Loa. If you trace back and take a look at the level at which the Mauna Loa CO2 is going backwards, that's the same as the level of CO2 from the core sample taken in 1860. So essentially what that says is for a full 100 years between 1860 and 1950, CO2 remained flat and CO2 actually decreased between 1891 and 1950. Once again, this is their data. I'm not making it up. I'm just reading their own chart, and yet they're claiming the atmospheric CO2 has been going up through the industrial age, where their own chart shows otherwise. There's still a problem with the chart, however. There's that gap, and when we looked at that previous CO2 chart, there wasn't a gap in the chart. So how did they get rid of the graph? Well, believe it or not, they literally just shifted it 83 years to the right. They made it continuous by just simply shifting the data. They eliminated the gap just by moving the data. They just lined it up. I cannot think of any scientific reason why you would ever do that. You just simply don't shift data just to make sure that you have a nice looking chart. That's just bad scientific practice. Now, when I first read about the shifting of the data, I thought that was too hard for me to believe. I thought that this was a hoax. So what I did was I literally went to the SIPL website to get the data, and sure enough, they have the data. I don't think you can read it on this presentation here unless you maximize the screen, but you'll see the data there, and you'll see the ice core date. They have an ice core date, the dating of the ice, and then if you look at what they consider the air age, they shift it over by 60 or 70 years. Once again, don't take my word from it. This comes directly from SIPL. Also, if you take a look at the CO2 concentration chart, you'll see that they take the ice core data all the way up to 2000. But once again, they have to dig down through feet of snow before they even get to the ice, and they're claiming that they have an ice core data from 2000. I would really recommend, for any other reason than this chart alone, download the presentation from www.theinternetskeptic.com and go take a look at this data. They literally just shift the data without any real reasoning. Because if you really think about it, bubbles float, and they would, as ice melts and refreezes, the older air would float higher. So if anything, the air trapped in a ice layer would be older than the ice, not younger, unless you, of course, defy physics. Here's another chart that shows atmospheric CO2 and temperature. This is a long-term chart, but the reason I'm showing this is, one, as you can see, this is ice core data and Mauna Loa. This is a very incestuous data set. This comes from Woodhull, one of the preeminent environmental groups. You'll find this chart from Sierra Club. Al Gore uses it. The IPCC uses it. The other thing I want you to notice is how they lay this thing out. They have one chart above the other chart, not overlaying each other so you can see the relationship. They have one over the other one, which kind of makes it difficult to see the true relationship, because what you're looking for in charts like this is one to turn up before the other. So the one that turns up first causes the other one to turn up, and that's how you look for the cause and effect relationship. In this situation, they're claiming that temperature or atmospheric CO2 causes temperature to increase, so you'd expect to see CO2 turn up first and then temperature. They don't present the chart in a manner that would make it easy to prove that or to see that. Once again, I want to just demonstrate that you'll see this chart again. This comes from a Sierra Club. More importantly, once again, is you see them one over the other one, not overlapping, one on top of each other. Also, I have written in horizontal lines, and as you can see, where the label, it says no SUVs, those peaks in temperature are well above the current peak in temperature. And so the question is, how can we be at record temperatures when their own data shows that we're nowhere near temperatures and nowhere near record temperatures? Okay, from that last chart, and as you saw, it clearly highlights the fact that atmospheric CO2 is off the charts. 370, that's a full 25% higher than any time before in recorded history, according to their own charts. The logical question is, the common sense question is, how then, if CO2 causes temperature to increase, how can you have atmospheric CO2 25% higher than at any time before in history, and yet temperatures are nowhere near an all-time high, according to their own chart? Okay, we just finished taking a hard look at the CO2 charts that they have. Now we're going to turn our sights on the temperature chart. And once again, I want you to think in terms of, what is a good data set? Does it make sense? Is this the way that you would normally do a scientific research project if you're trying to prove some kind of a theory? Okay, well, the only thing I can say is deja vu, because we saw a lot of monkey business with creating the CO2 chart. Well, here we have a lot more going on. First of all, I want to highlight the fact that the chart is from the northern hemisphere. That's what the first highlight is there. all this data is from the northern hemisphere. You don't see any of this research referring to the southern hemisphere, and we're going to get to that later on so that you'll understand the significance of that. Secondly, remember that the thermometer was invented in 1714. Remember, a thermometer is a direct measurement of atmospheric temperature. So you would think you'd want to use a thermometer when, if at all possible. Well, if you take a look at the chart, the data for the temperature comes from tree rings, corals, ice cores, and historical records between 1000 and 1890. Now, once again, the thermometer was invented in 1714, so you would expect not far after that you would have nothing but thermometer measurement, but they don't. They keep using tree rings, corals, ice cores, all the way up to 1980, basically a little bit more than 20 years ago. Okay. The thermometer data that they use goes from 1902 to 1998. Now, it's hard for me to believe that you don't have thermometer data going back before 1902 that could be used. Why is that significant? Is because between 1902, which is when the thermometer picks up or starts, and 1980, when they stop using the ice cores, the coral rings, and trees, you have a mixture of data sets. And as you can see, just from the own chart, that going way back, you have a wide dispersion of the data. And as you come forward and you get into the 19th century, you see that the deviation begins to narrow. Now, statistically, you would realize that's a bad data set to begin with because of the variation varies so much. Typically, you want to have the same variation throughout for a data set. Then you see that the very end spikes up and ascends rapidly. Well, that's where they're dropping off the ice core data, and they're going directly from a thermometer reading. So what you're seeing there is the reaction of a direct measurement versus a proxy. So they've removed the proxies which weighted down the average, and when they just started using the thermometer, clearly the data set starts behaving different than a data set that includes tree rings, corals, and ice cores. But it doesn't necessarily prove that you're at an all-time record high. Also, most importantly, is take a look at this chart. It is flat for the last 1,000 years. Okay, there is no medieval warming period, and there is no little ice age, according to that chart. Well, from that, I would hope you would ask the simple question, well then, forget all those proxies. What would have happened if we would have just simply used direct measurements of temperatures? Well, the way you do that is you go out and you find the longest historical record of temperature. And where you find that is Albany, New York. And what you'll find is that if you go and look at the data, I have the website right there that you can check out. If you go back to 1822, the average temperature was 49.2. The most recent value for annual temperature in 2005 is, you got it, 49.2. Absolutely no warming over the last 180 years. But once again, that's only 2 time periods. That's not really telling you that much. It shows you that simply the average temperature in 1822 is the same thing as the average temperature in 2005. 1822, I'd say, was pretty much before the Industrial Revolution really had its impact on atmospheric CO2. How you would test something like this, though, is you don't go with just 2 data sets. You go and you download the entire data set, and then you run a regression on it. Well, guess what happens when you run a regression on your entire data set going back to the early 1800s? You got it. The slope is negative. So according to New York weather measurements, the longest continual direct measure of temperature in the northern hemisphere, you get a negative slope. Basically, temperatures have decreased over the last 200 years or so. Also, I have a little clip there, the Arctic ice core is thickening. You keep hearing about the ice core melting and stuff like that. In all reality, the ice core is thickening. Here's where things really start to get fishy. And I have my little Viking on that milk cart is because he's missing. Remember when we were reviewing that, what's called the hockey stick chart or the temperature chart, I highlighted the fact that it was very flat. Well, that temperature chart was in the 2001 IPCC report. The problem with that chart is it totally defies what we know. It shows a flat temperature over the last 1,000 years, but we know the Vikings farmed up in Greenland, which is now basically a chunk of ice. So we know there was something called the medieval warming period. The Vikings are pretty much evident of that. Also, there's a claim that the Chinese sailed through the North Pole, meaning that there was an ice-free zone back in 1421. More interesting, however, though, is on this graphic you see that top chart, which is the chart that was in the IPCC report in 2001. However, the bottom chart there of temperature that shows the medieval warming period and shows the little ice age, that chart was in the 1996 IPCC report. So what they had to do is they literally threw out the data that totally disproves global warming in my book, or in my opinion, and they replaced it with a chart that's very bogus, that uses proxies, that doesn't make any sense at all really how they combined it. So they used a junk data chart to replace a chart that is more historically accurate. Now, why would you do that unless you're just trying to make a case that really isn't there? They're trying to fudge the data. They're trying to fool you into believing something without really having solid data or reasoning behind it. This is just another chart that shows you that temperature charts all over the place. They highlight the medieval warming period, a Holocene maximum. Also, remember over to the right there, you see the Viking ship. And you know, back then when it was much warmer, they didn't have V8 engines powering those boats. You know, they weren't driving Hummers. That was a very non-industrial era, and yet the temperatures were much higher. The bottom chart there, you see that big chunk of ice? That's like a current photo of Greenland. So you can see they once farmed that. So it must have been much warmer in the northern hemisphere. Here's just another example of a temperature chart, clearly showing that there's a lot more periods that were warmer than it is today. So we're nowhere near a record high. And they all show these medieval warming periods, a Roman warming period, a Holocene warming period, and they all show the little ice age. That's pretty much the record that was widely, or the historical temperature record that was widely accepted before these global warming scientists came along and decided to rewrite history. This is something I put in there partially just for general interest. This is a map that was claimed to have been produced by the Chinese back in about 1421, and it shows that the Chinese actually circumnavigated the globe. What's important about this chart, however, is it shows an ice-free northern pole area, and also claims that the Chinese sailed through it. So, you know, just as the Vikings farmed up in Greenland, there's also claims out there that the Chinese sailed through the North Pole during a period where there was no ice. So clearly, some historical records point to the northern hemisphere being much warmer in the last 1,000 years than it is today. This is just one more set of charts having to do with temperature, and you can see going back, temperatures were much warmer. If you look at the very bottom right, you'll see that at one time the Arctic was actually tropical. They claim that the Arctic temperatures were actually that, or were very similar to that of Florida. I put that partially just so that you know, it gives you a reason to go download this presentation. You can go click on that and read about it yourself. You remember a little while ago while I was highlighting on the temperature chart, I pointed out that it stated the northern hemisphere. Well, the reason it states the northern hemisphere, and I say that all you ever hear about is the northern hemisphere, is because the reason they don't mention the southern hemisphere is because the southern hemisphere is actually cooling. Data shows that it's actually cooling. So at best, global warming scientists can claim that you have a northern hemisphere warming. They cannot claim that you have global warming because the southern hemisphere is actually cooling. This is just a temperature chart of the southern hemisphere showing that it's been flat or falling. So once again, you don't have global warming. You have, at best, northern hemisphere warming if you rely upon those funny charts for temperature. It also raises the question, CO2, it gets dissolved in the atmosphere and would spread out globally. Why would different areas of the world if in fact the CO2 concentration was relatively the same, not all be warming uniformly. It doesn't make any sense if CO2 is actually causing temperature change. All right, are you confused yet? Well, if you're not confused yet, we're definitely going to get you a lot more confused. Okay, well, there's other ways to measure temperature, as you know, than from tree rings and coral samples. You can take it through satellite measurements. Well, the IPCC report claims that satellite temperatures show a slight warming in the atmosphere. The problem with that claim, however, is that NASA disputes it. They claim that there has been no warming over the last 18 plus years. Okay. What NASA claims is that both balloon and satellite temperature show no discernible warming trend over the last 18 plus years. So when you have three sources, you have ground, satellite, and balloon, and when satellite and balloon confirm that there's no warming, the global warming scientists have to rely upon only the ground measurements to make their claim for global warming, and yet they know that that is the measurement that is subject to bias called the urban effect. So once again, it gets back to general scientific practices. If you have two confirming methodologies and one that doesn't confirm it, do you ever go with the one that isn't confirmed, or do you go with the two confirming? For global warming science, you have to throw out the two confirming measurements and go with the one that you know has a bias in order to make your case. If, in fact, there's a solid case for global warming, you don't need to do something like that. The data will support it. You don't have to cherry pick the data, and when you're cherry picking the worst of the data sources, you know there's a problem. Well, from that controversy, NASA felt it needed to say something. The problem is, the IPCC comes out and says one thing, and NASA, who owns the satellites, runs the satellites, says something different. These are rocket scientists, and you don't want to piss them off. So they released a report in March 12th, 1997. Global Climate Monitoring: The Accuracy of Satellite Data. See, the problem is they misrepresented what NASA said, and these are rocket scientists. You don't want to do that. This is their statement. Recently, much scientific debate has focused on the global temperature of the Earth's lower atmosphere as measured by orbiting satellite. And while these data are exceedingly precise, verified by multiple satellite observations and balloon measurements taken in situ, they reveal no discernible warming trend in the Earth's lower atmosphere over the last 18 plus years. Now, who are you going to trust? NASA, who owns and operates and runs the satellites, or the IPCC? More importantly, why does NASA say one thing and the IPCC say the other, which totally contradicts it? Okay. Finally, if in fact NASA is correct that over the last 18 plus years there's been no global warming, most of this global warming trend has occurred within the last 50 years, or so they claim. So if you really remove 18 plus, essentially 20%, that means within the 30-year period of 1950 to 80, all this warming would have had to occur, and yet if you look at the charts, they actually show the temperatures decreased during that time period. So once again, another serious fly in the ointment. Unfortunately, that issue about the hockey stick chart and the flat temperature record didn't go unnoticed. This is a quote from David Deming, who was one of the scientists responsible for the temperature charts that showed the medieval warming and the Little Ice Age. Well, this is what he claims to have occurred, and I find it quite disturbing because it shows that there's a concerted effort out there to cover up some data. Once again, these are his words, not mine. Around 1996, I became aware of how corrupt and ideologically driven current climate research can be. A major researcher working in the area of climate change confided in me that the factual record needed to be altered so that people would become alarmed over global warming. He said, quote unquote, "We have to get rid of the medieval warming period." Now, this was said, this was said a while ago, and yet that's exactly what happened. You had the 1996 report that showed the medieval warming period and the Little Ice Age. And then you have the 2001 report that shows the hockey stick that shows a flat temperature over the last 1,000 years that claims that the Little Ice Age in the medieval warming period never did work. But the very fact that you have claims from credible scientists out there, scientists that actually contributed to the IPC, should give you a great deal of concern. This is just another set of scientists that weigh in on this issue. This is what they claim. The facts are simple. The Little Optimum and the Little Ice Age were real. They were also widespread over the globe. The 20th century is not the least bit climatically unusual. So why the recent media hysteria that the 20th century is the warmest in the last 1,000 years? That comes from 2 PhDs from the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. Now, once again, that hockey stick chart shows flat temperatures. However, we know from our own history that we had a Little Ice Age. Our American Revolution was fought during the Little Ice Age. You can see Washington crossing the Delaware. The Delaware at that time was blocked with ice. Delaware River never freezes over today. Also, the French Revolution. A large reason because of the French Revolution was because of the Little Ice Age causing starvation throughout Europe. You can see the picture there of good old Louis. When Marie Antoinette came out and said, "Let them eat cake," or at least she was claimed to have said that, let them eat cake, that was in response to the fact that the people were starving. The reason people were starving is because of the Little Ice Age had shortened the harvesting period and the severe weather had destroyed all the crops. So you can see that given the two choices of global warming or global cooling, global warming is definitely preferable. Global cooling has led to serious social uprisings and revolutions in the past. Okay, well, don't fall asleep on me yet. You know how we covered the data, do's and don'ts earlier? Well, I want to review correlation and coincidence. Remember that correlation does not prove causation. A theory explains the relationship. So just because two things are related or they move together doesn't mean that they're related. For instance, both storks and the birth rates have been declining in Europe. But the declining storks does not cause the declining birth rate. There's no theory that would say that because you're losing storks, you're going to have a lower birth rate. The best example I could find of a cause and effect would be the transparency of a dye. You come up with a theory that the longer you expose a plastic to the dye, the lower the transparency will be. So what you do is you take a dye, you take a lens, you dip it in there, you measure the different time periods, and as you see from that gradient, you'll see that as the exposure time goes up, the transparency goes down. That's a cause and effect. That's a correlation. Whereas the storks and the babies in Europe is a coincidence. They happen to occur together, but they're not really related. Okay, now why did I make such a big deal about that? Well, the reason I made a big deal about that is because that is the most important thing about global warming. It's a cause and effect relationship. The claim is that man causes CO2 to increase. The increase in CO2 causes temperature to increase. There's a cause and a relationship between greenhouse gases and global temperature or global climate change. Okay, well, cause and effect, what does that mean? Well, we've all heard about independent and dependent variables. When you have something like that, remember the independent variable must vary or change first, and it will cause a variation in the dependent variable. However, the independent variable must change first, and then the dependent variable changes. For instance, if you're boiling water, the independent variable is the burner. The dependent variable is the water boiling. Okay? So you must first turn on the burner before the water boils. The heat causes the water to boil. Never would the water boil before you turn on the heat. If it did, you'd have your cause and effect backwards. So the timing is critical. The independent variable must move first, and then the dependent. You must first turn on the burner before the water boils. Global warming claims that CO2 increases first and then temperature. That's the critical part of their theory. The independent variable is CO2, the dependent variable is temperature. Okay? So if you're going to make that claim, you better darn well have data showing that CO2 increases first and temperature increases second. Otherwise, your theory makes no sense. Well, what does the data show? Well, I went back to Real Climate to find out. And you know what? It turns out that CO2 does not lead temperature. In fact, temperature leads CO2 by 600 to 1,000 years. So what that means is, today the water boils, if their model is correct, today the water boils, and 600 to 1,000 years in the future, I turn the burner on. They have their model backwards. The global warming scientists themselves even know this. The facts are, temperature increases first, CO2 increases second. Temperature causes CO2 to increase, not vice versa. This is a totally misspecified model. They have their independent and dependent variables mixed up. And worse yet, they even know that. They're aware of that. You go to any statistician, go to any one of your statistics professors and show them an example where you mix up the independent and dependent variable, or tell them that your one variable changes 600 to 800 years in the future. They're going to clearly identify which is the independent and dependent variable, and you'll see that CO2 is not the independent variable. This graphic highlights the point. What I did was I took their chart and I blew up one area so you can see what I mean. The top chart is CO2, and you can see it's flat, staying at basically a peak level. But if you look down at the temperature falls through the floor. So how in the world can record high CO2 levels cause temperatures to plummet? It doesn't make any sense. And it just simply makes sense that temperature would drive CO2, because you have to first warm the earth before things grow. Once things start to grow, they start to produce CO2. And so just the general theory that CO2 causes temperature to increase doesn't really make sense. It doesn't hold water. It does make a lot more sense that temperature drives CO2, and that's in fact what happens. It's called the carbon cycle. Okay, I'm going to address a little bit of what Al Gore does in his movie, and I want to especially focus in on two of the charts. One, he uses the hockey stick chart, and two, he uses this chart. It's the scene where he gets up on his crane, goes up 12 or so feet to show where atmospheric CO2 is headed, in his opinion. Well, I had the good fortune of seeing Lori Davis, the producer of Al Gore's movie, at Ohio State University, and I addressed this chart, and I asked her the simple question that in her movie she showed a chart that showed CO2 hitting record highs. And I pointed out to her that if you looked very carefully at her chart, you'll see that temperatures were actually falling during that time period. She got real defensive and basically told me that my eyes were lying to me. Well, my eyes, I don't think, lie to me. And so what I did was I went and I got the book, The Inconvenient Truth, and copied the actual page. And you can see the numbers there, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Those are all peaks in temperature that occurred in the past. All of them are higher than they are today. So how can you, once again, how can you be at these record CO2 levels and the temperature be nowhere near a record high? I mean, just look at that peak in number 4. It's way above where we are today. And that's Al Gore's own chart. More importantly, Lori David seemed oblivious to this fact. She didn't even seem to understand the chart that she put in her own movie. Just to highlight my point, I zoomed in, and you can see that the current temperature is well off the previous peak, number 4, and more importantly, it's even off of its peak of about 1,000 years ago on the peak number 5. So the temperature is below and falling from the most recent peak, while the temperature is hitting this. I'm sorry, while the CO2 is hitting record highs. More importantly, remember that chart. That shows at least a V in temperature. What that shows there is the Little Ice Age. This is from Al Gore's own book. Now, we're going to go on and we're going to take a look at how Al Gore uses two charts in his presentation. So which one is it, Al? This is where I think Al really blows in his movie. If you see the chart on the left, Al Gore is using what's called the hockey stick chart. Temperatures are shooting through the roof, way above anywhere in the past 1,000 years. Okay, that's the hockey stick chart where he zooms in on the last 1,000 years. The chart on the right is the longer-term temperature record, but I've keyed off the last 1,000 or so years, and it clearly shows that over the last 1,000 years, temperatures have fallen into a little ice age and have been rebounding. So Al Gore uses two temperature charts that contradict themselves in his own movie. The conclusion that you should reach from all this, with the fact that the temperature increases first and then CO2, you should realize is that the global warming and climate scientists have their models back asswards. You know, you go to any statistician, they'll point it out real quick. Normally, you have a model that would say y equals mx plus b. The global warming model is misspecified. So what it is it's essentially the formula would be x equals my plus b. They basically have their independent and dependent variables wrong, and so it's a misspecified model, and it's not a model that should be relied upon. Here's another way that they present the data. This is CO2 and temperature when it does overlap, and what we're going to do is we're going to take a really close look at this data, and once again we're going to determine whether or not the conclusion that they reach is supported by the data. What's kind of funny about this one is you can see that this is the data from 1880 through 2004. In this chart, they do overlap temperature and CO2, and yet the other ones, they put them one above the other one, because when you put them over like this, going back, you clearly see temperature increasing first and then CO2. So they present the charts in a manner that makes it more difficult to catch the inconsistency in their theory. But here, they're showing a correct chart with one overlapping the other, and they're trying to show the relationship. All right, well, when we look at this chart, we're going to see why on the other charts they didn't overlap them, because once they do, you can really start picking apart their conclusions. First of all, when you take a look at this chart, once again it has CO2 and temperature. The black arrows represent the slope of CO2. As you can see in the first or the left side of the chart, the black arrow is relatively flat. In the second half of the chart, the right side, you see that the black arrow sharply increases the rate. Now, once again, this is that incestuous data that has Mauna Loa and ice cores. So clearly, the data samples behave in a different manner. Mauna Loa's CO2 is ascending much more rapidly. But most importantly is the CO2 rate of increase dramatically increases in the second half of the century. You'd have to come up with, for some reason, we must have started burning a whole heck of a lot more petroleum in the second half of the century. Take a look at the temperature, however. The red arrows represent the slope of the ascent of the temperature. And you can see on the left area where it's circled, I took that slope, copied it, and pasted it over to the right, maintaining a parallel shift. And you can see that the area on the left has a slope relatively similar to the temperature slope to the right. You have those two circled areas. What that means is that during the early part of the century, temperatures increased at a certain rate. During the second half of the century, temperatures increased at essentially the same rate. You have two periods of increasing temperatures essentially growing at the same rate. However, if CO2 is causing temperature to increase, if the rate of increase of CO2 sharply increased, you would have expected to see temperature rate of increase sharply increasing, yet you don't see that. Also, take a look at that chart real carefully. In the middle, you see that temperatures essentially fell between 1940 and about 1980. So there's a 40-year period during this last century where temperatures actually fell. Why is that significant? Because remember, NASA said during the last 18-plus years, temperatures have not increased. Their own chart shows that temperatures fell between 1940 and 1980. So during the second half of the century, where the environmentalists claim all this warming occurred, using their own charts and NASA's chart shows that temperatures have actually fallen or remained flat over the last half century. They have not increased. And once again, that's using their own charts and data. All right, I titled this portion, We the Sheeple, and we're going to take a look at the global warming consensus. So far, I think we pretty much dismantled their charts on CO2 and temperature and debunked their idea that CO2 causes temperature. Now we're going to take a look at what seems to be their strongest point, or the area that they seem to hang their hat on, is that everybody agrees with this. You can't disagree with it. I mean, it's obvious. Once again, I think our biggest problem is if in fact people do, if there is a scientific consensus, you've seen the data, you've seen what they've done, and I think it's safe to say that if there is in fact a scientific consensus based on that kind of data, we have some real serious problems, and the problems are a lot more severe than global warming. We've basically corrupted our educational system and our scientific community because none of that data should ever have been widely accepted, and there's no way, in my opinion, you should ever be able to reach a consensus on that kind of data. This is, at best, what they've done is gone back and cherry-picked data to support their conclusions. They have not followed a very solid scientific process. This comes from Al Gore's movie, and basically it's a picture of his book showing the big old 0% there, essentially saying nobody in the scientific community disagrees with a man-made global warming. And you can see my little dog there. Join the global consensus or die. All right, I'm just going to use some common sense and consider that claim. If there was a scientific consensus and if global warming was so well proven, don't you think someone would have gotten a Nobel Prize for it? Well, how many Nobel Prizes have been given for proving global warming? 0. More importantly, the consensus is a complete 180 degrees away from where it was just 30 years ago. If you can take the same group of people and reach a consensus after being 100% wrong just 30 years ago, there's a serious problem there. Al Gore, in his own movie, mocks the scientific consensus. In the very first scene, he mocks the consensus that at one time people didn't believe that the continents were connected. He then later mocks the scientific consensus that at one time they said smoking was healthy for you. Just in my own lifetime, you've got the consensus of overpopulation, the 10-year supply of oil, the coming ice age, the flat earth was at one time a consensus, the disconnected continents was one time a consensus, man can't fly, it'll never make it to the moon, silicone, ALAR, you can just go right down the list of these consensuses that have continually been wrong. And once again, the truth isn't determined by consensus. It's not popular opinion. The facts determine the truth, not public opinion. And in fact, if in fact global warming is so well proven, why do we still have people out there trying to prove it? Why do we have global warming departments at our universities? I mean, we prove that the Earth isn't flat. You don't have flat Earth departments anymore in our universities. It's been proven, it's gone. So if in fact global warming is proven and it's a commonly accepted fact, let's start closing down our university global warming departments. We don't need them anymore. They've done their job. Well, it's easy to have a consensus if it's enforced at the end of a barrel of a gun. And academically, that's kind of what they do. They demonize, they don't necessarily use military means to enforce a consensus, but they do quite a bit of personal attacks and habit attacks. Anyone who steps out of line, they're sharply criticized. And here's just one example. Also in scientific discussions, sometimes the sentiment that the generally accepted view of the scientific community is heard, as if verification or falsification of the scientific hypothesis is a matter of majority vote. Once again, you don't sit there and think, okay, how many people think the flat Earth or the Earth is flat? Everybody raises their hand. That doesn't make the Earth flat. What makes the Earth flat would be if it was actually flat and the data would support it. So popular opinion isn't how you reach the truth. He also makes a comment down here, derogatory statements about a person's scientific reputation are least helpful. Often the less firm arguments are, the more is the interpretation based upon scientific authority through majority. Meaning that if you don't have a solid argument, you don't have the data, your theory doesn't hold water, what you do is you try to run around and get all your buddies to agree with you, and that seems to work in the global warming community. But once again, that's not good scientific process. You allow the data to determine the theory, not public opinion. Here are just some of the quotes that I've been able to find regarding this issue. This comes from I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name, but you can read it there. Attempts to support the global warming thesis with analysis of the carbon dioxide content of air bubbles in glacial ice samples is based on fudged data and ignorance of the physical process of glacial ice formation. Now, as far as the academic community, when you start using terms like fudged data, that's a smackdown. You don't find that very often. Down below, you can see another quote. From the very beginning, the hypothesis of anthropogenic greenhouse warming was tainted with the biased selection of data, and I think we proved the biased selection of data, ad hoc assumptions, and I think we've proven a lot of the ad hoc assumptions, that were not verified experimentally, and one-sided interpretations, such symptoms of the affliction, which Irving Lemire called the pathological science. As you can see, anyone who takes, at least in my opinion, anyone who takes an unbiased view of the data and the processes reaches this conclusion. And yet this gentleman is considered a skeptic, and he is demonized. Yet I've shown you every claim that he just made is a very valid and legitimate criticism, and yet the people come out and attack him. Bottom line is, you've seen the data. You've seen what he's talking about. Is he credible or not? Is he making a valid claim? And if he is making a valid claim, why are they attacking him instead of addressing the issues that he raises? The key is you have to silence the opposition, because you don't want people doing what we're doing today, and that being dig into the numbers. You want a person like Al Gore, a politician out there, brushing over the facts, showing charts without digging into the detail like we're doing today, because that's the only way you can sell this idea of man-made global warming. You can't dig into the data and really reach the conclusions that they've done. Also, the very claim that there's a global consensus on this is just inaccurate. As a matter of fact, here is someone that comes from the heart of the belly of the beast, the War Churchill land itself. This comes from a professor from Colorado State University. Colorado State professor disputes global warming is human cause. Global warming is happening, but humans are not the cause. One of the nation's top experts on hurricanes said Monday morning. Bill Gray, who has studied tropical meteorology for more than 40 years, Gray, who is a professor at Colorado State University, said human-induced global warming is a fear perpetuated by the media and scientists who are trying to get federal grants. Now, this is coming from a guy from Colorado, and for him to step out of the line in that state and in that community, the War Churchill community, you've really got to be pretty brave, and you've got to be pretty confident what you're saying is the truth. Down at the very bottom, he says, I think we're coming out of the little ice age. Once again, even he recognizes the little ice age, but the IPCC does not. And warming is due to changes in the ocean's circulation patterns due to salinity variations. Not CO2, salinity variations and ocean currents, Gray said. That is, I'm sure of that. Once again, you can download this presentation, click on that, and it'll take you to the original data. But once again, the claim that the consensus is out there just doesn't hold water. Okay, here's just another example. There's something out there called the Oregon Petition. It states that in 1998, 17,000 scientists, 6 of whom are Nobel laureates, signed the Oregon Petition, which declares, in part, there is no convincing scientific evidence that the human release of greenhouse gases is causing or will, in the foreseeable future, cause catastrophic heating of the Earth's atmosphere and the disruption of Earth's climate. How in the world can you possibly have a consensus if 17,000 scientists disagree? Clearly, someone didn't get the memo. They didn't drink the Kool-Aid. But you can read other ones. There's other examples on, surveys that have proven that there is no consensus. And once again, if you're relying on just consensus as as the strongest part of your argument, you don't have much of an argument. Vive la France! Even the French are joining in the fact that global warming isn't man-made cause. As you can see here, decorated scientist defects from belief of global warming caused by man. This is one of the top French global warming scientists, and he comes out and says that he doesn't believe that man-made CO2 is causing global warming. What's also interesting about this piece is if you see off to the right, you see the snows of Kilimanjaro. Well, he's doing what we do with this. We take a look at the data, and he's disproving what Al Gore says about the Kilimanjaro glaciers. He claims that global warming is not causing the glaciers of Kilimanjaro to shrink, and the temperatures have not been increasing, and he has a little right up there about what actually is causing it. But once again, even this guy, a Frenchman, is coming out and saying, look, Al Gore's lying, and man-made CO2 does not cause global warming. So the skeptics are worldwide, not just here in the U.S. All right, no study of this topic would be complete if you didn't understand the basis behind everything. And so we're going to take a look at what is called the carbon cycle, and we're going to take a look at the numbers. We're going to see who produces CO2, and we're going to take a look at, does this make a lot of sense when you take a look at the numbers behind everything? All right, well, this is the carbon cycle. Each one of those cycles shows that carbon gets put into the atmosphere and then it gets pulled back out. The largest producer of atmospheric CO2 and the largest absorber of atmospheric CO2 is the ocean. And it absorbs and releases about 100 to 115 billion tons of atmospheric CO2. Over towards the right, you see the trees. You notice arrows are leaving the trees. Trees breathing produce 40 to 50 billion tons of atmospheric CO2. Once again, I want to stress that. Trees breathing produce 40 to 50 billion tons of atmospheric CO2. So the largest producers of atmospheric CO2 are the oceans and trees breathing. I bet you didn't know that. Over to the far left, you'll see a factory. That number is so small, it's 5. Man burning produces 5 billion tons. To put that in scale, the variation in the ocean, which is 100 to 115, is 3 times the production of man. Now, just the normal variations of the ocean produces 3 times more than man does. So you can see that Mother Nature easily handles the amount of output of carbon dioxide that Mother Nature does. She does it just through the variations of the oceans. The other thing is, trees breathing produce 10 times as much atmospheric CO2 as man does. Trees breathing. So you can see the numbers just simply don't add up. Man is nothing more than a drop in the bucket when it comes from atmospheric CO2. And the problem the global warming scientists have is they hang their hat on CO2, which is an insignificant greenhouse gas, and they're trying to twist everything to make it sound like this is significant, when you look at the numbers, there just isn't enough there. All right, well, when you take a look at carbon dioxide, if you really look at who's creating carbon dioxide, it's Mother Nature. But the other important point is that you can't defy laws of physics and chemistry to make your argument. And that's essentially what the global warming people have to do. Unfortunate for the global warming people, there's something called Henry's Law, which is the diffusion of gas in a liquid. Now, you can think of the oceans similar to the hemoglobin in a bloodstream. You breathe in oxygen. It is exposed to blood with a low concentration of oxygen, so oxygen absorbs into the bloodstream and is bound by hemoglobin. The blood then goes to an area where there's low partial pressure of oxygen, and it is released. Well, that's exactly what the oceans do, and anyone can do an experiment with a bottle of champagne or a soda bottle. If you chill it, you can open it, and it releases very little CO2. If you warm it up, CO2 comes flying out of it. Well, that's essentially what you can think of as the ocean. The ocean is like a giant pop bottle. Mother Nature regulates the diffusion of gas in a liquid. So let's assume that we put more CO2 in the atmosphere than Mother Nature wants, because she balances things based upon a partial pressure, which is the amount of CO2 in the air, and a temperature of the water. So let's say the temperature is 50 degrees and we increase atmospheric CO2. Well, Mother Nature would simply absorb the excess because she's going to determine the balance, not man. And the only way she wouldn't do that is if you can prove that the oceans are saturated with CO2, which you can't. So in order for global warming theory to actually exist, you have to repeal Henry's Law. There's just simply laws of physics or chemistry out there that hold, regardless of whether man's producing CO2 or not. Mother Nature has a built-in buffer and a built-in mechanisms. More and interestingly, however, is the diffusion of gas and liquid decreases with temperature, so Mother Nature herself deliberately increases CO2 by releasing more of it from the oceans as she warms the earth. So the more interesting question isn't about global warming, about CO2, it's why does Mother Nature have a built-in mechanism that deliberately increases atmospheric CO2 with an increase in temperature? Because for some reason, she prefers more CO2 in the atmosphere with an increase in temperature, not less. So either the global warming scientists are right, saying that it's a bad thing, or Mother Nature is right, saying that it's a good thing. I am willing to bet on Mother Nature 100 out of 100 times when compared against the conclusions reached by the global warming scientists. So once again, for them to be right, Henry's Law has to be repealed, and Mother Nature must be wrong, and I don't believe that. Other sources of atmospheric CO2 are organic growth, more breathing, more respiration, more CO2. Decomposition, more trees, they break down, they decompose, they get eaten, they turn into methane and CO2 as termites decompose them. Fire is a great example. Even though we don't have many more acres of forest today, our forests are far more dense. So when we do have these fires, we're producing far more CO2 than a normal forest fire would be, because you're burning actually more trees because of the fire prevention has increased the density of our forests. And you can see just from right now, there's just thousands of fires going on. There's 46,000 fires right now in the U.S. alone, burning about 2.5 million acres. So you can see that when Mother Nature pollutes and produces CO2, she produces huge amounts, dwarfing anything man could ever dream of making. This slide just shows you the power and the scope of what Mother Nature does when she pollutes. This is Krakatoa, and it created this is a volcano that went off, and it produced so much pollution that it created a year without a summer. And that's just one volcano. Man is a drop in the bucket. When Mother Nature gets angry and starts polluting, she does a tremendous job, and she weathers it. She has no trouble absorbing it and going on. And so to think man, with his little insignificant contribution, can do anything close to what just a single volcano can do, I think is just unrealistic. This is just another slide showing that Mount St. Helens is the state's largest polluter. So you can see, once again, the scope of Mother Nature's pollution just is tremendous compared to anything man does. Now, that slide I just showed you was Mount St. Helens when she wasn't active. I wanted to just show this one to show you the extreme force that a single volcano can do. This has the output of Mount St. Helens. It released the equivalent of an atomic bomb every second for 9 hours. The scope is just unfathomable. I mean, you can't even understand the amount of energy and pollution these things create. Once again, 9 hours. For 9 hours, every second, an atomic bomb went off for Mount St. Helens. It produced enough rock and crud to fill a football field 600 miles high. I'm willing to bet you could take every power plant, SUV, pollution-producing anything, stack it together, and you're not going to be able to fill a football field 600 miles high. 3 billion cubic yards of rock, ash, snow, and ice were thrown into the atmosphere. Okay? 230 square miles were severely damaged. 230 square miles. I bet that's bigger than a small state. Double-check me on that, but that's a lot. So when Mother Nature pollutes, she's just she just dwarfs anything man could ever dream of doing. But if anything, download this presentation just to take a look at that website and look at the extreme destruction just a single volcano can do. Well, then you ask me, okay, if it's not CO2, then what's causing global warming, if in fact it does exist? Well, what's causing global warming is the exact same thing that is called global warming each and every single time in the past. It's a normal cycle of basically 100,000 years of ice age, 12,000 years of warming. What causes that? Solar cycles. There's all these sorts of documented solar cycles. Most importantly is what was the explanation for previous periods of climate change were all due to the sun. And in order to make the extraordinary claim that this time is different, you have to have extraordinary evidence. And from the review of the data that we've done, I think it's pretty safe to say they don't have that extraordinary data. But you can see that on this slide right here, you can see that the sun explains 80 to 85% of all climate change. That's one study. There are many more of them. There's the certain solar cycles that occur that you can take a look at the links But clearly, it's been well documented in the past that the sun causes the climate change, and this is the first time that they're attributing it to global warming CO2. If I'm going to make the claim that the sun is causing global warming, I better have some evidence of that. Well, lo and behold, guess what? The sun is warmer now than at any time in the past 11,400 years. Think that's a coincidence or a correlation? Global warming, people say we're going through a period of warming. The sun's going through a period of warming. This is not rocket science, people. What's kind of funny about this is if you think about it, the Earth goes through global warming on an annual basis. They're called the seasons. And what causes the seasons? It's the Earth relationships to the sun. And so you can clearly see that the sun does greatly impact our climate. It is the cause of our seasons, and it's not unreasonable to think that a little changes in its output or a little change in the orbit or the tilt of the Earth could lead to climate change. And it certainly has caused it in the past, and it's essentially what's causing it today. Even Al Gore recognizes that it's the sun. In his book, The Inconvenient Truth, he points out the fact that what's melting the polar caps is the sun. The sun's heating the ocean. The oceans, by the way, reflect very little light. So there's not a lot of light to reflect to be reabsorbed by the global warming gases to begin with, if you're dealing with reflected light. So you can see that the sun, even in his own book, is the cause of melting ice caps. Read that. Go into his book, read it. Nowhere does he mention atmospheric CO2. So Al Gore has it right on that page. He just doesn't. He forgets to stress it in the movie and clings to the CO2 argument. Well, as the quote says in the bottom, in the natural sciences, if you can't measure it, you can't prove it. Well, that's the problem with global warming science. They can't prove it. Once again, as I've said, if you're going to make this claim that CO2 leads to temperature change, you need to have a simulated weather system. You'd have to have a simulated atmosphere. You'd have to have a light or some kind of a radiating source maintained at current levels or at consistent levels. You'd control for the energy input, and then you'd alter the CO2 level of the atmosphere. Now, that's pretty common sense. That's simple science. If, in fact, the global warming people could do that, that would be on the front page of everything. But the fact is, they can't do it, because when they do it, they find out that changing atmospheric CO2 doesn't do diddly for changing in temperature. You could do this as your own science fair project for a state science fair project. Just create your atmosphere, shine a light on it, alter the CO2 level, and see if, in fact, the temperature of the atmosphere changes. You'll find out that it doesn't. However, if, in fact, you simulated an atmosphere and you altered the light in small amounts, like altering the sun's output, you do, in fact, find that the temperature changes. And that's what this article highlights. It highlights the research that you can prove small changes in the sun causes temperature. You cannot prove that changing CO2 changes the temperature. When you make such an obvious claim, you sit there and think, why didn't everybody think of the sun? Well, just guess what? They did. Duh. If you take a look at these headlines, you'll see, guess what? Scientists blame sun for global warming. Okay? Sun is reaching the hottest in the last 1,000 or so years. Most importantly, however, once again, you know how I said about the presentation of the data? Look at the data. Look at that chart. That is a solar output being overlapped to temperature. Clearly, there is a tight fit and a strong correlation. The theory is the sun heats the earth or causes temperature increase. There's a tight correlation, a causative relationship, cause and effect. You don't find that with CO2, and yet the global warming scientists ignore the sun. And they, as we saw, they also ignore water vapor. But the fact is, the data's out there, the research is out there, the conclusion's been reached. This conclusion is what they blamed all other warming and cooling periods upon. The same conclusion that they reached before exists today. Only this time there's a political reason to change the conclusions. Here's another way that a true scientist would take a look at this data. If they're going to come out there and they're going to say, okay, the sun is causing global warming. Well, the Earth isn't the only thing impacted by the sun, right? We're in a solar system. What you would then do is say, okay, if the sun is causing global warming on Earth, is it in fact causing global warming on other planets? Well, lo and behold, guess what? Mars is going through global warming. And I don't think the Martians are up there driving around on SUVs. And I don't think they have power plants, and I don't think they have petroleum. So clearly there's a common denominator. There's one factor influencing both Mars and the U.S. and Earth, and that clearly is the sun. I put this slide in just to highlight how they kind of hide the truth, or they tell half-truths. CO2 highest for 650,000 years. Yep, the conclusion obviously is man's causing it. But look a little bit more closely. Not only is CO2, according to their own data, hitting record highs, so is methane. So what does that tell you? It's not just CO2 greenhouse gas. All the greenhouse gases are increasing. And it's not all of them are due to man. So clearly there's a natural phenomenon leading to the greenhouse gases. CO2 is easy because we know Henry's law exists. Mother Nature's deliberately going to increase it as she warms the earth with the sun. But here's just a good example on basically show how they kind of tell half-truths. The headline should be CO2 and methane. And then once you did that, suddenly people would start asking the question, wait a minute, man doesn't cause methane. Or methane is mostly caused by natural causes, decomposition, agricultural things like that. All right, the next thing you're probably thinking is, wait a minute, are you telling me all these scientists are lying? You're telling me they're making this stuff up? Well, believe it or not, first of all, you have great examples with DDT, LR, silicone, examples of them where, yeah, they may not be lying, but they're deadly wrong. On this chart right here, you can see that there's a report out, global warming models are biased. People in the scientists in the southern hemisphere are saying, wait a minute, you guys have ignored us. You're ignoring us. And so even scientists who look at the data understand that their models are biased, and yet they ignore the fact that they're biased. I don't hear anyone coming out and saying, wait, we can't rely on these models because they're biased, and yet scientists are writing reports about how biased they are. Most importantly, the greatest scientist ever, Albert Einstein, claims that his biggest blunder was when he created something called a cosmological constant, which in scientific terms was essentially a scientific lie. Normally in science, you collect data, you run tests on it, and you let the data shape your conclusion. The data and the theory reaches the conclusion for you. Well, Albert Einstein, when he was trying to prove the theory of relativity, remember at his time, they didn't know the universes were expanding. They thought the universe was static. So when he would run his models, he kept getting an answer that he didn't expect, right? Because he's in the frame of, he didn't know what he didn't know. He didn't know the galaxies or the universe was expanding. So when he kept getting these results that didn't support his conclusion, he thought, wait a minute, I know more than the data. So I'm going to introduce something called the cosmological constant, which now in hindsight we know was a mistake, because the cosmological constant simply corrected for the fact that the universes were expanding. Had he known that the universe expanded, he would never have done that. But the important point is that even the greatest scientist ever, when faced with my model's wrong or facing the truth, defended his model and made tweaks to it to give it so that it gave him the answer he was looking for, instead of the true answer, which is what the data was pointing to. That's the important thing. And that's what global warming scientists, I feel, are doing. They're going out and cherry-picking data to defend their position and totally ignoring all the data that doesn't support their position. And you can find, evidence for, you can find a little bit of evidence for almost anything. You can find evidence out there that pigs can fly if you look hard enough. But that's not the type of science or research that reaches credible conclusions. All right, well, the next question you've got to be asking is, but why? Why all this hype? Why would they be doing that? Well, we're going to take a look at some possible examples. I can't get into Al Gore's mind. I can't read Al Gore's mind. I don't know what he's thinking, but I can hypothesize why you would do this type of campaign. I can look back at past history on the motives behind people who have politicized science. And we'll take a look at, what are some possible reasons on why there's this campaign to push global warming. The first and most obvious reason you would do something like this is money. John Stiles reports that $25 billion has been spent on global warming since 1990. But here's just some examples on, environmentalist groups rely on stuff like this. This is how they motivate their base. This is how they get people to give them money. You get the fear of God put into people, and they want to rise up and take action, and that's what they do. Also, you can see that California is recently suing the auto manufacturer, planning a lawsuit against the auto manufacturers. Once again, here's a harm. People always sit there and say, okay, the benefits are that we're going to save the earth. But also, these environmentalist policies have huge costs. GM and Ford are teetering on bankruptcy to begin with. Lawsuits like this can run them out of business, so it costs many people their retirements, their jobs, their livelihoods. Another example is Ranson just recently pledged $3 billion to global warming research. So clearly, there's a lot of money being spent on this field. Also, how do you get funding for your big government social programs? If you're a big government type person, you have to keep coming up reasons on why people should be willing to pay tax dollars to the government. Well, here you have it. Al Gore says pollution tax, not payroll tax. So he's coming up with ways that the government can take more of your money by getting you scared about global warming, and so they're going to go out and save it, just like they save the tobacco people who smoke. They save the tobacco people by taxing cigarettes, right? They didn't make tobacco illegal. They kept tobacco alive so they could keep taxing it. If they were honestly trying to help the smoker, they'd ban tobacco, but they don't. They keep it alive so they can keep funding money. So the hidden agenda behind many of these type of efforts is not really to help the people, but it's a way for the government to get more of your money. Al Gore, this is a great example. Al Gore says pollution tax, or a tax on carbon. And you've also heard carbon tax ideas floated around. So once again, if you look deep enough, there's probably a hidden agenda behind it. It's probably big government. Government needs more of your money. They're going to use the money for social programs. And the best example, once again, is just to look at what they've done with tobacco. They didn't make tobacco illegal. They just simply taxed it so the government could get its slice of the action. The next obvious one is power. Al Gore is going to use global warming as a stepping stone to the White House, the most powerful position in the world. So you can see that if someone's out there trying to seize power, global warming is one means to do that, and Al Gore is going to use it. The next is fame. Celebrities love this kind of stuff. You get your name in the press. Just look at Al Gore right there. He's eating it up. You make documentaries. Hollywood has you out for all sorts of parties and things like that. So you can reach a great deal of fame if you support this stuff. Another example is control. People who want to control people rely on things like this. Lyndon Johnson, what you have here are two clips from two videos. The one on the left is called the Daisy commercial. It was done by Lyndon Johnson. The fear factor in that one was nuclear war. The one on the right is global warming. I encourage you to download this presentation, click on that to see what it's doing. But they essentially took the same fear factors that Johnson used to motivate people to vote for him and to control their lives using the Daisy commercial. The global warming people are currently using almost the same thing in order to get you to feel the same emotions about global warming, motivate you to get up and act, motivate you to go to the voting booth and put their people in power. Just look at Al Gore's movie poster for his movie An Inconvenient Truth. By far, this is a quote from it, by far the most terrifying film you will ever see. Now, typically you want to have unemotional scientific review and reaching conclusions. You don't want to be scaring people into knee-jerk reactions. So Al doesn't use a scientific approach like one of the best reviews of the science out there. No, he uses by far the most terrifying film you will ever see. The other thing is a global warning. Okay, these aren't the type of rational, unemotional terms that you use. This is clearly scare the people, get them to the voting booth. We got to get people motivated. What are some other possible causes? Well, I believe there's an honest disagreement. I mean, some people honestly believe global warming is going on, and if you believe the data, I mean, you can find, as I said, you can find data to support almost anything out there. And so, if they're willing to, bet on their 1 in a million possibilities, then people have an honest disagreement. I also believe people believe it's like almost like a religion. I believe that there are environmental fundamentalists out there. They just simply believe everything man does is wrong. They're going to do everything they can to fight it. Once again, there is select data out there that supports it. Not very solid select data. The overwhelming evidence, I think, as we've shown, supports causes other than CO2, but there is some slight support for it. As in any model, you have significant and insignificant variables, but even those insignificant variables have some contribution to the final output, and so they look at the minutia instead of the big picture. China. This is global warming taxes and things like that are anti-competitive. So countries that wouldn't have to abide by the Kyoto Treaty have a huge incentive to push this. There's also the other thing that you hear a lot about is why not? I mean, if we could, why shouldn't we do it? Well, you can't always just talk about benefits. The way that you discuss these issues are costs and benefits. So the benefits of decreasing CO2 are this, and the costs are this. Do the costs outweigh the benefits, or the benefits outweigh the costs? Well, what are the costs involved with stamping out man-made CO2? Well, you can't get any real good estimates. I've been able to find estimates that range from 12 billion to 300 billion a year. 300 billion is a huge amount. I mean, that's a percentage or so of your GDP. So, you know, you can't just simply say, well, what's the harm? Well, the harm is it's going to cost you a lot. Also, you can see that California sues 6 car makers over greenhouse gases. It can cost people a lot of their jobs. Also, in my opinion, there's just simply better uses for the money. I mean, do we really want to take a % or so of our GDP and just flush it down the toilet? We could be soaring up Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. We could be funding more education. We could paying down the deficit. The bottom line is we just simply aren't a rich enough nation that we can just start pouring away money like that on chasing our tail issues like global warming. We've done it with DDT and all these other issues, ozone. You know, we've caused a lot of harm, but we haven't seen a lot of benefit from it. So once again, think in terms of this is your dollar, which it is. It's your tax dollar. Do you want them spending this on fighting global warming, or do you want them soaring up Social Security, our educational system, or paying down the debt? All right, now we're going to take a look at one other aspect of it, and I call it the politicization of science. And you can look back, if you've ever read Michael Crichton's book, State of Fear, he addresses this. Because one thing you don't want the politicians getting into the field of science and them influencing the conclusions. Once again, you want the data leading you to the correct conclusions. You don't want the politicians pressuring you to find certain things. One of the most horrific examples of politicization of science was eugenics. Eugenics was the progressive thought of the early 1900s. Well, the progressive idea of eugenics mutated into Nazism. And the foundation, by the way, of eugenics came from Darwinism. Interesting history as far as that science goes. Here's just a quick example of the harm of politicization of science. DDT is the most recent example of it. The banning of DDT literally cost 1 million lives a year. It was banned back in '72, so you can make the claim that it would cost around 34 million innocent lives were lost, and many more ruined because of malaria. And you can also see there's other links there for other examples on the politicization of science and the tremendous harm that it's done people. Nazism, once again, being the greatest example. Now we're going to take a look at some of Al Gore's claims. I have a quote here from Dr. Fred Singer, president of the Science and Environmental Policy Project. His website is www.seppa.org. He invited Al Gore to come and give his presentation to his group, and Al Gore comes up to him afterwards and asks him, what did he think? Well, this is Dr. Fred Singer's response, and once again, as far as the academic community goes, this is about as close to a smackdown as you can get. And remember, this Dr. Fred Singer is not a young man. He is saying this to a much younger Al Gore, but this is what his answer was. Your presentation is very persuasive to anyone that doesn't know the science. He literally said that to Al Gore's face. I had the great honor to meet this gentleman and talk with him, and he has a presentation very similar to what we're doing today, where you just simply look at the data and ask the question, does this data support their conclusion? His conclusion is, no, it doesn't. And I have a feeling that's probably the same conclusion you're reaching by watching this presentation. One claim that Al Gore makes, and it seems to be the theme of the global warming people, is that global warming is our greatest threat. It's the greatest threat facing our nation and our world. Well, I just think if you look around, there's a lot bigger threats that we have. I don't know of anyone that's died from global warming, but I know there's a lot of people that are going to die from other causes. This is one of the most disturbing parts about Al Gore's movie. He points out the population bomb. This is a theme that, as I said, they mentioned back in the 70s. And so what does he do? He points out that we have a serious population explosion here in the U.S. But what is his solution? Does he address it from the terms of, this is a problem we've got, how are we going to feed these people? No. He addresses it from a global warming perspective, which actually works against feeding these people, and I'll show you why. One theory about atmospheric CO2 can be proven. That is that crop yields increase with an increase in atmospheric CO2. That's why yields of crops increase with global warming. Al Gore's solution of pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere would actually decrease crop yields. Now, one, that's going to give you less food to feed people, but two, if you decrease the yield of a crop, that means you need to plow, plant, fertilize, herbicide, more acreage to get the same amount of corn. So Al Gore's solution of pulling CO2, decreasing CO2, actually works against the cause of feeding these people. So Al Gore is putting nature, junk science, above possibly lives of people in the future. The alternative, or what I would call Al Gore's final solution, is simply decrease the crop yield to slow down growth. I mean, he's not saying that, but the result of his approach, the result of banning DDT has resulted in the devastation, destruction of millions of human lives. And I just don't want to see the world just keep repeating the mistakes that are the result of environmental policies. Okay, I'm not the only one out there addressing what Al Gore said. This comes from the 3rd Viscount of Benchley. It is a science-based response to Al Gore's global warming commentary in London's Sunday Telegraph, dated 19 November 2006. This is worth downloading the presentation alone. Just go download it. You can click on that and you can go read it. I'm not going to go through every one of his points, but this is a very thorough scientific rebuttal of Al Gore. It's definitely worth reading. And once again, you just start to see this common theme. The science is so bad, it is so easily picked apart and disproven that anyone with a basic understanding of science can do it. And that's essentially what we've done here in this presentation. This is something I wanted to point out that you see written about quite often. It has to do with the IPCC reports and how they're created. The IPCC reports have two things. There's a summary for the scientists and a summary for the policymakers. And this is the claim that you'll see repeatedly made. The summary for policymakers at the head of each of the UN's reports are written not by the scientists at all, but by the political representatives of the governments. There is a repeated evidence of substantial and significant departures from the science in these political summaries. In every instance, the discrepancies move in the direction of overstating and exaggerating the supposed problems even more than the scientific selections. So once again, the part that the policy readers are getting is the most biased and not exactly represented in the correct manner. I encourage you to go take a look at this IPCC report, and you'll understand what we're talking about when you see it. This is another piece that rebuts Al Gore. I'm not going to go through each one of those, but it does highlight how he used the hockey stick chart, and we reviewed the hockey stick chart and how bad science that is. Also, we reviewed how not only did he use the hockey stick chart, but he used the other one that shows the little ice age in the medieval warming period. So even Al Gore doesn't have his facts straight in his very own movie. The other thing is to point out that in his movie, if that's the best, I mean, you would think that only the best data that they've got they would be presenting to the IPCC, and Al Gore would be in his movie. And just ask yourself if that's the best data they've got. If these bizarre temperature and CO2 graphs is the best data they've got, don't you think there's not a whole heck of a lot supporting this theory? I mean, if there was solid evidence supporting global warming, man-made global warming, you wouldn't rely on, you know, charts of Mauna Loa and ice core and having Al Gore using 2 different temperature charts. And you certainly shouldn't be able to reach a conclusion using that kind of data. These are just some more claims. I put this in here so that you can pause the video and read them for yourself. But once again, many people are out there dismantling things that Al Gore said. This documentary is more similar to Fahrenheit 9/11 than it is to anything really scientific. Here's another, just a little bit more on Al Gore. He failed to tell the viewers that 48 scientists whom he quoted are having accused President Bush of distorting science, or were part of a political advocacy group set up to support the Democratic presidential candidacy of John Kerry. So here you have these people, these quote-unquote unbiased scientists attacking President Bush, and yet they're signing up to help John Kerry get elected. If that doesn't tell you enough about their judgment, I don't know what would. This is just a little clip out of Al Gore's book, and it shows that pretty much starving people destroy the environment. And so the last thing you want to do is start forcing people to starve because they'll end up destroying the environment. And the solution to that, by the way, that destruction there isn't due to global warming. It's due to political policies. And you can see that one's a failed political system, namely communism, socialism, and the other one, the rich neighborhood, the rich capitalist countries typically have better environments. I put this one in here just because of the irony, and I encourage you to watch the Internet Skeptic DVD or video on ethanol. It's called Dethanol. He highlights Brazil. Well, Brazil is the world's largest producer of ethanol, the alternative energy source. Well, ironically, how are they producing ethanol? They're cutting down the rainforest and planting sugarcane. So if that's an environmentally friendly fuel source, you be the judge. But clearly, once again, there's another example on how these knee-jerk reactions of the environmentalists actually end up harming more than they help. There's another clip from Al Gore's book, The Exploitation of Man and the Environment. Al Gore would rather have us out walking behind an oxen instead of driving a tractor and feeding our people. Here's just another example in Al Gore's book on how he's attacking agriculture. He doesn't seem to understand that agriculture, increasing crop yields, feed people. It improves the lives of people. That seems to be a secondary concern to him. He's more concerned about what we've done to the environment instead of what we're doing to people. Al Gore also makes the claim that the population of polar bears is decreasing. If you download this presentation and go to that rebuttal of Al Gore that I showed earlier, what you'll find is that the polar bear population is not decreasing. In fact, it is increasing. So bottom line is they just don't have data that supports their conclusions. They're using this fear of killing polar bears, where in fact they're increasing in numbers. They did the same thing with Prudhoe Bay. They claimed that the pipeline was going to harm the caribou herd. In fact, since the pipeline was built, the caribou herd has multiplied by a factor of 4-fold. The reason for that is the pipelines are warm, they grow lichen, and they're a food source for the caribou. So actually the pipeline was an environmentally friendly addition to the environment, and it helped the caribou survive. It certainly didn't harm them. But of course you won't ever see the environmentalists tell you that. This is just an example on how poorly Al Gore forms his arguments, or how poorly he understands the data on which he bases his conclusions. This is his effort to show that the weather damage, or the weather has been getting far more severe, or the climate is getting far more severe with the hurricanes. So what did he do? He went out and he used insurance claims. First, and going back in time, first of all, everybody who's ever taken finance or economics 101 understands the difference between real and nominal dollars. Al Gore uses nominal dollars for his presentation. So at best, what his chart demonstrates here is inflation. Also, we've developed more homes on the coast.
we've insured more homes on the coast that are worth a great deal of money. So there simply were more things to be insured to be destroyed when a hurricane did hit. In the past, when you'd hit the Florida coast, there may not have been very many condos there. Now when you hit it, they're packed with condos. So clearly Al Gore uses a misleading stat, insurance claims, to make his argument. And once again, if in fact there was solid data and science behind these claims, they wouldn't rely on these statistical tricks to try to fool the public. The only time you rely on these kind of tricks to try to fool an ignorant public is when you don't have a solid case. If he had a solid case, he'd put it out. My God, he made a 2-hour movie, and the best he can do is make these phony claims and use bad data, like a hockey stick chart that's even inconsistent with the other chart that he uses. If that's the best data they've got, and they claim that they've reached a scientific consensus on that kind of science, just ask yourself, common sense-wise, does any of this stuff make sense? I would argue no. This is just one more example I find ironic. Al Gore highlights forest fires, global warming causing more forest fires in his book. If you really look at the fact of why we have these catastrophic forest fires today where we didn't used to have them, once again, it was environmentalist policies. I encourage you to read the book Playing God in Yellowstone. Environmentalists, because they prevent you from thinning out the forest, from any kind of harvesting of trees at all, our forests have actually become more dense. I've seen some reports that claim that our national forests are 7 to 11 times more dense. That means that when you light a fire, because it's so dense, the fire easily goes from one tree to another, whereas in the past, Mother Nature would routinely thin out her forests with forest fires, which, by the way, forest fires are clear cutting. Have you ever seen a forest fire? They don't sit there and selectively pick trees. They clear cut an area. And so ask yourself, would you rather have a forest company clear cut a forest or Mother Nature clear cut a forest? At least when a forest company does it, you get the same result, but at least you can get furniture and houses and books out of it. But the point here is that environmentalists, through their policies, have disrupted nature, made our forests more dense, so that now when you have a forest fire, you don't have just a normal forest fire that's easily contained. You have what they refer to as catastrophic forest fires that, A, kill many endangered species. If you're a spotted owl in these forest fires, you're dead. And so once again, these environmentalists, they actually end up hurting what they're trying to help. Here's another illustration in the book, and I put this one in here to show that not all the effects of global warming are bad. Al Gore points out himself is that with global warming and the melting of glaciers, we would increase our wetlands. Ironically, what wetland did he point out? Well, we would turn San Francisco, of all places, into a giant wetland. And I'm sitting there thinking, there's a lot of environmentalists that live out in San Francisco, and I say, let's give them a taste of their own medicine. They want to restore the wetlands, let's flood San Francisco, start driving your SUV and get the temperature up, all right? This is just a little clip here to show that old habits never die. You know, when I said back when I was a kid, they were screaming there's this coming ice age. Well, believe it or not, ice in the greenhouse, Earth may be cooling, not warming. So they're bringing that back. In the financial sector, this is what you'd call a hedge, because they know an ice age is coming. They always do. And so they're hedging here that, in fact, if an ice age does come along, they can say, hey, wait, we told you so, remember here? Once again, selectively choose the data. Or better yet, what they've done is they've said global warming will cause the next ice age. I love that one. That's a hedge of all hedges. There's no way for them to be wrong that way, because whether you got global warming or an ice age, you're right one way or another. Also at the very bottom there's a link, global warming. Enjoy it while you can. It's basically just an article that compares the costs and benefits of global warming versus global cooling. And I think if you read that, you understand real quick that given the two options, you want global warming over global cooling. Okay, well now you got to be asking yourself, well, you know, okay, put it all together for me. Well, remember the global warming scientists have this incredibly, almost embarrassingly simple, elementary type of a model. Man-made CO2 causes global warming. Anybody who knows anything about these multivariable models knows that very rarely can you model something as complex as the weather with a single variable. It's just simply absurd. In the financial industry, we have something called a beta, which ties the movement of a stock market to the movement of a individual stock. But once again, there's not a great relationship. But that's the That's the only major single variable model that I can think of out there, and it doesn't do that good of a job. If it did, we'd all be millionaires, by the way. So this is what I would say causes climate change. Solar cycles, clearly, that they have in the past, they will in the future. Variations in the Earth's orbit around the sun, variations in the solar system's orbit in the galaxy, natural greenhouse gas variations, volcanoes, forest fires, and other natural pollutants, continental drift altering in the size of the oceans, basins, and landmass, cyclical weather and ocean patterns, occasional asteroid impacts, ocean currents and salinity changes, changes in the Earth's magnetic fields, and changes in the Earth's axis. All those factors should be included in a global warming model, not just atmospheric CO2. You can see that that is a far more robust model than what the scientist has. And just simply ask yourself, does that sound like a more reasonable model than man causes CO2, causes a global atmosphere? I mean, that's embarrassingly simple. And to sit there and think that that simple of a model can explain all the environment, the major environmental changes of this Earth, I just think is ridiculous. And if you go talk to any real scientists in the hard sciences, they would probably reach the same conclusion. All right, so let's wrap this up. In conclusion, CO2 isn't at record levels if you rely upon flash data. Flash data does not show record level CO2s, as we've proved. Temperatures aren't at record levels, according to Al Gore's own chart. The only temperature chart out there, which is called the hockey stick chart, that shows that we're at record temperatures, is highly criticized and is inconsistent with basically records that we already know. For instance, we know the Vikings farmed up in Greenland. That chart would say otherwise. The other most important thing is temperature drives CO2, not vice versa. Temperature is the independent variable. CO2 is the dependent variable. Their model is misspecified. Go to any statistical professor, ask them what that statement means, and they'll identify it for you. They've got the horse in front of, they've got the carriage in front of the horse. They've got the model back asswards. CO2 is at best an insignificant factor in global warming. I think we proved that just by simply the quantity that man produces, only 5% of a trace gas. So it's highly unlikely that such a small amount is going to have a big impact. Global warming theory isn't supported by the scientific method or their own data and models. As I showed you, in order to reach the conclusion they've reached, you really got to manipulate the data. You've really got to cherry pick your data. And if this was a sound theory, you wouldn't need to rely on such tactics. Global warming theory is the result of a misspecified and underspecified model, meaning that misspecified means they have an independent and dependent variable. It was reversed. Underspecified means that they just simply ignore many, many significant variables. Once again, I did this for educational purposes. If anyone's out there in statistics, this is a great example on what those terms mean. It's also worth going to talk to your science teacher about so that you learn a little bit more about how to create these models and what they mean. It's an underspecified model which requires data manipulation and violations of commonly accepted scientific practices to reach its preconceived conclusion. That's the biggest problem I see with this global warming theory is when you see what they've done, it's as if they reached the conclusion, or they wanted to go out and prove that man causes global warming, instead of asking the question, what causes global warming, and then going and searching for data to explain it. What they did was they started with a conclusion, let's go prove man causes it, and then they went on and they cherry-picked and found data and created data sources to create their argument. That's not science. Science is a search of discovery, not to try to prove something. And that's what they've done here. And that's why you get all these funny techniques and data sets that are just inconsistent with good scientific practice. Okay, if you made it to the end, congratulations. I know that was a lot of material. It's taken a lot of work to create it. I hope to make this into a documentary. But in the meantime, I do hope you visit the website, theinternetskeptic.com. Go download this presentation. Use it for a science fair project. Get the word out. Please forward this link on to as many people as you know, especially to science teachers or people in the media. I think this is a review that I think everyone should do, especially before they go vote next time. And lastly, I am a capitalist. I believe in the capitalist system. This took a lot of work. I do not receive funding from anybody but myself. I did this as a hobby, out of interest. I don't like seeing politics and science mixing. I don't like to see what they've done to discredit the field of science. I don't like what they're doing. And so this is my effort to try to stop it, to inform the public, inform the people on the truth and how you can use science for both good and bad. And I think this is a great example of how you're using science for the bad. I do encourage you, if you did enjoy this presentation, and even if you didn't, why don't you go to the internetskeptic.com, click on the I want to donate now button, and send me a few bucks. It'll help me keep this up for a while. Right? Hope everyone enjoyed it, and keep watching the website both on YouTube and Internet Skeptic for more in the future. I do encourage you also to go watch the Dethanol one, or the one on ethanol. It does a very good review on the science of ethanol.